3 terrifying true fog horror stories you can't ignore, and I promise, after the first one, you're going to double-check your mirrors before saying it was just weather. I drove that stretch of Highway 101 from Eureka more times than I can count. I knew the turns by heart. I knew which mile markers had reflectors that fell off in winter. I knew what the shoulder looked like in daylight. Nothing about that night lined up with anything I'd learned the hard way from driving back roads as a kid. The fog didn't just come in. It moved like a thing with plans. I was coming back late. It had been one of those weekends where the clock gets shady with you. Strained laughter, a couple of last-minute goodbyes. The radio faded to static because I'd been talking to myself more than to the songs. I remember forcing the heater higher just to scrape the chill off my hands. The road was nearly empty. The sky was the deep, wrong kind of black that swallows headlights a half-second sooner than you expect. At first, the fog was the usual coastal kind, a wash, a soft white blanket rolling down off the water and into the trees. It was thick enough that the painted lines were just pale suggestions. I slowed. You slow instinctively in that stuff. Your speed becomes more about conversation with the car than control. Too fast, and you end up putting the whole world in sudden motion. Too slow, and a truck might appear like a fist through the curtain. It was on the right shoulder, like somebody had stepped out of a memory. I saw him first as a darker patch against the fog, standing with his hands at his sides. He was close to the guardrail, like he'd been waiting for a ride. I didn't swerve. I glanced over because you glance at a person on the shoulder the way you glance at another driver. Briefly, clinically. He had a hood up, nothing that said anything to me except that he was trying to be anonymous. He was still. There was no posture that said, "Help me," or "Don't get close." He was just there. I drove past, maybe 30, maybe 40 miles per hour, too fast in hindsight, but not reckless for most foggy nights. I glanced in the rear view because your eyes do that, looking to see if someone follows when someone is standing alone. The shoulder sped away. The hooded figure was still standing there, but when I checked again, he was gone. That should have been the moment to relax, to chalk it up to sleep-addled imagination. I didn't. Less than 5 minutes later, I came around a gentle bend, and a figure stood in my lane. Not a silhouette on the shoulder, not a mime of a person half hidden by the white. Someone stood directly in the lane, mid-road, seemingly oblivious to me until I was within the time it takes a blink to count. I slammed the brakes. My chest turned into a fist. The car crouched and the ABS stuttered. For a second I thought it was a hitchhiker who had stepped off the shoulder to flag someone down. That would have been the sensible, explainable thing. Someone staggering, waving, the kind of story you tell in diners about drunken drivers and good Samaritans. He, if he was a he, didn't flinch. He just looked at me, eyes, hood, the pale wash of fog around him. That's when the hair along my arms leaned like a plant toward light. We locked attention for a breath. I could see the rim of his face, the line of a jaw, the way the fabric of his hood fell. It wasn't like the way you lock eyes with another driver on a long road and share a polite glance. This was too still, too deliberate, as if the moment had been held up for inspection. I remember thinking in a ridiculous, dislocated way, if he moves now, I have to steer. If he doesn't, I still have to go. I eased the car back into gear. The world narrowed into two things, me and the person in the road. I rolled down the window a hair because I wanted solid air inside, not fog. The sound the fog made then was a kind of thick muffling, like the normal frequencies of the night had been put in a jar. Even the engine sound seemed clipped. Then something hit the back of my car. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was the kind of impact that translates instantly into the language of survival. Lurch, a crunch that vibrated through the seat, the sensation of momentum snapping. My first thought was a truck, then a deer, then something worse. My hands slammed the wheel, and I braked like I'd been taught in driver's ed when the unexpected collapses into view. The horn screamed, because that's what horns do when the body wants to claim space. I didn't look back for long, not because I was reckless, but because the impulse to flee was louder than the impulse to check. The hooded figure in the road blurred toward the edges of my vision as I gunned it and pulled off at the next turnout, an empty, shallow patch of gravel that held the light from my phone like a weak sun. I remember parking with my heart trying to climb out of my throat, the noise of the car suddenly too intimate. I checked the rear bumper with my phone light. There was a dent, a deep, honest crease in the center, like someone had set their fist and pushed. It had pushed the metal inward and left a shadowed edge, a kind of fold. There was no paint transfer. The paint itself wasn't scraped in a way that would suggest another car's color had been rubbed into mine. No blue, no black streaks, just the dent and the crumpled chaos of metal where the bumper refused to keep its shape. That's the line that made my head start arguing with my chest, because a dent is a physical fact, a dent is evidence. But evidence doesn't explain the thing you saw before the impact. A person steady in the middle of the lane, eyes like a pause. I crouched and ran my fingers along the edge where the paint buckled. My fingers came away with a speck of grit, fog residue, but not a shred that said, "This came from a car." If it had been a deer, there would have been organic debris, fur, a smear of something. The dent could have been the result of a hit and run by something metallic. It could have been a slow collapse from a prior bump that I hadn't noticed. But I knew where the dent came in the story I was telling myself. The night, the hooded figure, the jolt. My brain wanted tidy causality. The world refused to supply it. I called my parents because calling them was the thing you do when you have both the time and the small, urgent need to be told you're not irrational. They were asleep, of course, and woke up to a sleepy, clipped version of my voice. They asked where I was. I said I was safe, mostly. I lied about being okay, not because I wanted to hide fear, but because fear sounded ridiculous in the daylight. We made plans for me to stay the night at my old room, where a lamp has always lived for me like a friend. The next morning the dent was still there. In daylight its dark crease looked more like a bruise. I drove it to the driveway and sat on the tailgate for a long time, hands in my hoodie pocket, listening for explanations. The mechanics at a small shop later told me it was the kind of impact that could have been caused by a solid object. Maybe the corner of a bumper or a large rock. They didn't offer snapshots of the figure in the road. No one did. No one came forward and said they saw a man on the shoulder. The fog had scattered everything into a puzzle with missing pieces. After that night I stopped saying just fog. I started saying that fog like it was a memory that had sharpened into a particular thing. But even then, I kept hunting for rational anchors. Sleep deprivation? Maybe. My mind playing tricks? Possibly. Someone trying to hassle a stranger on the road? Could be. The dent was stubborn evidence that the collision had been physical. But the lack of paint transfer, the way the hooded figure had seemed to stand there with a patience that didn't make sense, it all made a mess out of tidy explanations. You learn to carry both ideas at once. Things have mundane causes, and sometimes the mundane explanations leave you with more questions than answers. If you've ever driven in coastal fog and felt like something was watching, tell me in one line down in the comments. Yes or no. I'm serious. Just yes or no. I want to see if that uneasy feeling I felt that night is something other people notice and file away as night-driving paranoia, or whether it sits in a drawer with a dozen other small, stubborn fears. If that first one unsettled you, wait until you hear what happened on a run through the woods, where even the trail map started lying. I went home for spring break partially to sleep, partially to avoid talking about senior projects with people who didn't care to hear. I started running again because running is the cheapest sort of repentance. You put on shoes and physically move forward until your head empties a little. There was a loop near my parents' place that I'd learned in high school, the kind of 3-mile circuit that collects old summer smells and fits neatly into an hour. It was so familiar that I used to close my eyes and let muscle memory carry me through the turns. That familiarity was part of why I chose it the day the fog sat low and heavy, like unwashed sheets. The fog in the woods is not the same as the fog on the highway. On the highway, fog takes its time, rolls in from the water and smooths everything out. In the woods, it sits up close and personal. It piles in hollows, it clings to low branches, and it makes trees look like ghosted pillars. On that run, the air felt wet enough to drink, and the kind of dense that made breath visible. My headphones were tucked away, because I like to hear my feet and the world when I'm on that trail. Sounds help me keep pace. I had my watch on with GPS, because even on a familiar route, it's nice to have an honest, indifferent clock. About a mile in, the watch started to act funny. It flicked between being my faithful timekeeper and a small, panicked cartoon. One moment it showed my route as a neat line, the next it was an unhelpful blob. I checked the mileage in my head, mile markers are muscle memory, and the watch was telling me I was still on the part of the trail I had just left. The map dot shrugged in place when I moved forward. GPS errors happen under heavy canopy and in fog. I get that. But it was an odd, curdling kind of wrong. The kind that takes a practical equipment problem and makes it feel like the world is playing a trick on you. Then the sound started. It began as a thin, wavering drone, low enough that the trees seemed to hum with it. You know the sound, I mean, the kind that sits under everything else and makes your teeth feel like they're keeping time with a distant engine. Except this wasn't mechanical. It had a resonance that nudged the hair on the back of your neck like a cold hand. I slowed without meaning to, taking smaller steps, because in my experience smaller steps make you less visible if visibility is a concern. The drone changed pitch slightly, as if matching the rhythm of my breathing. I told myself it was the wind in the branches, the kind of natural resonance woods make when they decide to sing. I told myself the human brain loves patterns and would happily stitch together a drone that matched my cadence. But patterns are not the same as precision. While I was bargaining with reason, softly, the drone adjusted exactly when I did. I would pick up speed, and it would climb a fraction. I would slow, and it would flatten. It wasn't occasional. It was persistent, like someone walking 3 paces behind, keeping the same stride. The sound did not have a visible source. No rustling where someone would be, no feet crunching leaves, just that unplaceable tone, somehow aware of me. That's when the peripheral vision started to act up. Little movements at the edge of sight that my brain flagged like a parent worried about a child. I turned a corner, and the fog thinned in a patch, which made the tree line look further away and then closer again. I told myself to take a breath, to be calm. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I did what people do in those situations. I picked up my pace, not running, not yet, but enough to push the sound behind me. It followed. There's a million ways to rationalize it. Maybe someone was following from a distance to make sure I got home. Maybe a motorized unit deep in the woodland had a failing component making that pitch. Maybe something, somewhere, had the uncanny ability to harmonize with my stride. The woods in fog make your senses unreliable, and I understood all of that in a head full of footfalls. I still could not reconcile how sound could walk with me without physical accompaniment. That's a different kind of wrong, one where the map of cause and effect has a hole you can fall into. I rounded a bend where light from a neighbor's porch leaked thinly between trees, a domestic yellow that always made me feel a little less alone. The drone didn't stop. It rose like a throat clearing, the pitch wobbling in a way that felt almost attentive. I stopped. The kind of stopping that isn't planned. The kind where your knees decide on their own because your mind is busy cataloging the problem. For a second, everything leaned in. You know how some sounds feel like they're trying to get closer but never make contact? This was that sound, plus the feeling of being measured, and then I saw it. Not fully. I saw a mass of darkness at the edge of the trail, beyond the reach of the porch light, where the fog made everything soft and poorly defined. It was taller than anything I'd expect to find casually standing there. tall enough that I thought at first it could be a fallen limb arranged oddly against a stump. Long, gentle sways of the silhouette matched the rhythm of the drone. It seemed to move in fractions, an almost imperceptible rocking that made the trees around it shiver with a different, smaller motion. My heart thudded loud enough that I could hear its rhythm behind the drone. I was halfway between running and not running. My mouth was dry, the sensible actions lined up in my head: call someone, make noise, turn back. Instead, I froze so that I could better see, the way you hold still to read a tiny print when it matters. It was not a person I could name. I stepped forward because part of me needed proof, and as I did, the drone shifted pitch to match my step again, and the shadow at the trail edge seemed to lean just a little toward me. The fog curled around it like smoke around a candle, and the sway wasn't violent. It was almost like a person breathing. But nothing about breathing explained the precise matching of motion and sound. I felt watched and measured in the same breath. That's when my knees remembered the word run before my mouth could. The woods have a particular way of swallowing sound. When you move, your own footfalls get eaten. I bolted. I didn't run in a stealthy, controlled way. I ran like someone who had finally been given permission to be frightened. My watch beeped at me with an update, as if to record the absurdity. My pace spiked to sprint, the GPS still lagging, my breathing a loud, ragged thing in my ears. When I broke out of the tree line onto the neighborhood street, the drone and the looming shadow were gone. I told my parents in daylight later, trying to make it into a strange anecdote. But there's always that part where you see someone's face change shape, and you know they're filing your story under weird things kids do. The rational explanations marched in: wind patterns, deer moving a branch, auditory hallucination from exhaustion. But the drone matched my pace. The shadow swayed. And even the older me, who likes tidy answers, keeps a little mental box labeled "that day in the woods" that I don't open unless I already have company. I was still buzzing from that jog 2 days later when I decided to call Edwin and tell him about something else entirely, because talking about weirdness with friends is how you test whether the unease is just yours. He laughed, then made a suggestion that put a different kind of knot in my stomach. "Let's go out on Willapa Bay this weekend," he said. "Fog's coming in, we should get some pictures." I almost said no. I have a rule about not leaning into odd situations just to see what happens. But Edwin is the kind of friend whose confidence rubs off like a coat. He has a kayak and an easy laugh that makes risk sound like an adventure. We're both experienced on the water, both careful in our own lazy ways. We planned a morning paddle, the kind where you bring extra layers and repair tape, and the kind of small checklist that's both practical and a little ritual. Life vests, dry bags, a spare bilge pump. The idea in my head was simple. Observe, get a few shots for the feed, be back by noon. Fog on the bay is different from both the highway fog and the woods fog. It hangs in layers, sometimes as thin as a sheet and sometimes as thick as a wall. Water reflects less than land. The fog makes the horizon forget it ever existed. There's a certain hush over everything. Waves lose their teeth, oars become the main percussion, and the world's edges blur. We launched in silence, more due to the fog than to any concerted plan. It felt respectful to let the place be. We paddled with the quiet concentration of people who know their gear and know the rules. It was early, the kind of early where the only lights are on the horizon and your breath has that steam fog thing. We were a couple 100 yards off the shore, where the bay is a soft bowl and the tide edits the shoreline every hour. That's when we began hearing oars. Not right beside us, not the kind of sound that announces someone sitting within arm's reach. It came from somewhere beyond the fog, a rhythm of strokes, dip, pull, slide. The pattern was steady. It didn't change tempo. We both stopped paddling and listened. The rhythm seemed to come from the left, then from the right, as if the fog was folding sound like paper so that we couldn't tell where it began. We scanned the grey. Every now and then the fog would thin, like a curtain breathed on, and you'd peek through and see a shape, the bow of a little rowboat, a dark wooden edge with an oar in the lock, an empty seat. Then the fog would close again, and there'd be nothing. I lifted my binoculars and saw a boat that seemed solid in one breath and non-existent the next. Edwin shrugged and said he'd heard it before. Locals talk about boats that vanish in the morning, but I could tell he was as unsettled as I was. There's a competence in him that rarely wavers. When that competence faltered, it made the silence heavier. We paddled slowly toward shore because that's the safe move. Closer to land, closer to witnesses, closer to anything that isn't the middle of an open, fog-swept bay. The oar sound kept its pace like a metronome, like a person rowing somewhere that time didn't reach fast enough. When we pushed into a small inlet to land, the fog thinned and then closed like the gate of a jealous keeper. The landing was a shallow, sandy edge I knew from other sunnier days. We hauled the kayaks up and set them on the damp sand. That's when we noticed the footprints. They were wet, barefoot prints leading out of the water, clear as if someone had just stepped from the surf. The prints headed diagonally away from the place where the rowing sounded like it had been coming, toward a stand of reeds, and then up into a narrow path between low dunes. They looked recent. Not only recent, but improbable on certain counts. Whoever had made them would have had to be barefoot in cold water. Whoever had been rowing a boat would have had a slower transit than 2 kayaks, which meant either they'd be behind us or they'd arrived earlier. But the timing didn't make sense, because we had both seen the occasional glimpse of a dark boat moments earlier. We followed the prints part way, not because we thought we'd solve the thing by walking up a path, but because human reflexes in the face of the uncanny are the same. We seek to close the gap. The prints disappeared under a thickness of grass where the sand became clumped, as if whoever made them stepped into soil that swallowed evidence. We looked at each other in that way friends do, that says, without words. Did that just happen? Did we just see a boat and then see prints, and now these prints lead into nothing? We turned back toward where we'd left the kayaks, and that's when we saw the boat. It was dark wood, old-fashioned, flat bottom, a single pair of oarlocks, beached at a strange angle on the sand, as if it had been deliberately nudged sideways. It matched the glimpses we'd had earlier. It matched the rhythm of the rowing. It shouldn't have been there where we found it, because we had been paddling slower than a rowed craft could make the distance. And fog doesn't give you shortcuts in time. The boat's interior was wet. There were wet footprints on its gunwale, as if someone had stepped out and left the boat propped to the side. There was no one in sight. That was the kind of material evidence that claws at the rational mind. A boat, footprints, the smell of wet wood. None of it screamed the supernatural. None of it faxed a label that said, "What happened?" It did, however, insist that something happened. It was stubborn in a way that made arguing against it feel childish. We decided to get out of there. We didn't reason through possibilities. We didn't decide to poke further. We packed our kayaks with hands that felt suddenly clumsy, and we left the beached boat and the prints and the question their presence raised. Whatever explanation you accept, someone beached the boat and walked inland, a fisherman who'd wandered off, a prank. The imprint of it stuck in my head like a burr. We were experienced on the water. We knew the tide, we knew the currents. The timeline felt wrong in a way that didn't sit comfortably with either of us. When we reached the car, we sat and didn't speak for a while. The bay had gone quiet under the fog again. The oar sound didn't return, at least not while we watched. We left without telling anyone the details, because some things feel too small to be a headline and too big to be a joke. We told ourselves the practical next day stuff: lock the car, get warm. But you can't lock away the fact that there was a boat beached on the shore with wet prints leading inland. I'm telling you all this because these three events, on the highway, in the woods, on the bay, have this pattern. Fog arrives, something appears and disappears, and then evidence remains. Sometimes the evidence is a dent. Sometimes it's footprints. Sometimes it's the memory of a sound that matched your pulse. You can call it coincidence. You can file it in the weird coastal things folder. I drive less at night now. I avoid long solo runs when the mist sits low. I think about the rules being rearranged. There's more, though. There's a part of me that keeps thinking about how the fog behaved, almost like another player that night. Obscuring, altering distance, making small noises into sentences. How does fog hold a sound? How can visibility and perception be tampered with in ways that leave physical clues but no clear chain of cause and effect? Maybe there's a meteorological answer that would make me feel childish. Maybe there's a social explanation, a prankster, a fisherman, an errant truck. Maybe the three things are unrelated and I'm drawing lines between them because that's what we do. But the patterns nagged. I'm not finished with any of these stories, not really. There are loose ends I haven't tied, questions I still twist in my head in the middle of the night, and I'm certainly not finished telling you. If you're still here, if you felt that cold prickle when I mentioned the dent or the footprints, then keep listening. The wood story isn't over, and the bay story has another angle involving Edwin that I haven't gone into yet. There are details I held back to avoid rushing to a conclusion you might not be ready for. But before I go on, if you've ever been in fog and found something that didn't line up with what you know, I want to know. Drop a short yes or no in the comments. That's it. One line. I'll read them. Now about the woods, I told you I ran out, right? I thought I left it at that. A jog that turned into a sprint and then the relief of street lamps and a route back to the house. That's what I told my parents. What I didn't tell them until later was the way the sound seemed to match me like a shadow, the way the silhouette leaned as if interested, and the small thing I noticed on the trail the next day that made me think I hadn't imagined the whole event. The trail had scuff marks in the soft earth, not directly on the path, but along the embankment, like someone's feet had dragged sideways in a way normal runners don't. They were shallow and not recent enough to be from that night alone. Old in a way that made me wonder how many fog days had kept their own secrets. I kept that detail to myself for a while because there's a difference between being cautious and paranoid. But now, laying the pieces out, I see the through line so clearly. The fog scratches at your map of things, and the scratches are what we're left scanning later, trying to make a picture of something that won't stay put. I will tell you the rest of what happened during that week, and why I started carrying a small tape recorder in my pocket on walks after that, and the one night I got a recording of a sound I couldn't place. I'll also tell you why my hands still go cold when the weather app says dense fog advisory. I'm going to stop here for a minute because the rest of the woods piece leans into something that still tightens my throat. But I want you to hold the dent, the drone, the wet footprints in your head the same way I hold them. Objects that refuse to be merely weather. Keep them with you as we continue. There's a line that connects all three nights, and it's not a tidy line. It's jagged, like fingernails drawn across the map. That jagged line, the dent, the drone, the footprints, kept looping in my head in a way that felt almost rhythmic, like some private metronome I couldn't quite stop. A few days after the run, I started taking a little digital voice recorder with me on walks, the kind of thing you buy to catch ideas for essays or grocery lists. It felt stupid at first, like bringing an umbrella for the sun. But it was also an excuse to pretend I was being methodical instead of just trying to hold on to something less slippery than memory. On a slow afternoon, when the sky had the milk-white look fog gets just before it decides whether to stay or go, I walked the loop again with the recorder clipped to my jacket. I kept my phone off to avoid temptation, the same way you mute a feed when you're trying to look at a photograph closely. I didn't expect anything to happen. I expected the recorder to be a witness to nothing more than my breath and my shoes. 20 minutes in the device caught something. When I listened later, headphones pressed to my ears in the kitchen, the sunlight a soft rectangle on the table. I heard the normal sounds first. Shoes, a car in the distance, a dog that barked once and gave up. Then, layered under everything like a secret, there was a low, wavering tone. It was the same kind of drone I'd described aloud to my parents, but recorded. I rewound. I slowed it down. The tone held a rhythm, not exact tempo, but an unsettling sympathy with the sound of my feet. When I sped the clip up, the pitch rose and the effect was disorienting. When I slowed it down, some harmonics showed up. Subtle, almost organ-like undertones that didn't make sense in a stand of trees. What struck me more than the tone itself was a timing detail. Around 32 seconds into the file, there was a faint additional sound. A soft, shuffling scrape to the side, like something moving across packed earth. It wasn't a footfall you could identify as deer or human. It was sideways, a drag or a slide, and it happened right when the drone took a slight wobble on the waveform. On the recording, those two things, drone wobble and the scrape, sat together like two things that had been rehearsing a duet. I played it for a meteorology forum more as curiosity than hope. People suggested wind in a certain frequency, leaves rubbing in concert with a culvert, electronics picking up a distant engine. All plausible. None of them made me breathe any easier. There's a particular loneliness to having an object that insists something happened without giving you the why. The recorder couldn't say whether the sound was the woods humming or a person with a strange instrument. It could only be faithful to the waveform. That week I stopped taking the usual route alone when fog was predicted. I misread that as bravery. In reality, I was just avoiding the thin edge of memory where the sound sat. If I walked, I took a flashlight, and if it was foggy, I texted someone a "Hey, I'm out" with enough detail to keep me honest, but not so much that it felt like dramatics. The tape didn't solve anything. It amplified the problem. Whatever was out there had left a trace, and traces are the worst kind of compulsion because they demand interpretation. Around 2 weeks after the kayaks, after the footprints and the beach boat, the thing with Willapa Bay started rolling in my head again. Edwin and I didn't talk about it much in public. When you tell a friend something that can't be neatly explained, there's an exchange where you both test the language for it. Edwin and I had the same unspoken rule. If we were to go back, we'd do it during daylight, and we'd bring gear beyond a dry bag. We didn't go back immediately. Life has a way of filling gaps with smaller tasks. Finals, work shifts, family things, but these stories don't respect busy seasons. They keep simmering under whatever else you thought you had decided to forget. One morning in late spring, we drove back to the bay before sunrise. Not because we were looking for proof, at least we told ourselves that truthfully, but because something about returning felt like a way to stop being haunted by the not knowing. We brought a camera, rain jacket, spare shoes, and Edwin insisted on a small handheld GPS he used for fishing. We were careful, not showy in our caution, but tidy and practical. The tide was pulling out. The fog was thinner than the first time we were there, the sort that lets you feel outlines at a distance. At the landing we could see where the boat had been. The sand bore the impression of a hull having been dragged or nudged. There were still faint little scuffs in the wet sand where someone had stepped up onto a gunwale. But where the old dark rowboat had been beached, there was nothing now. No wreckage, no stains, nothing that pointed to a reasonable explanation involving removal. We took photos, close and far, careful to document but not to disturb. The thing about photograph evidence is that it insists on something literal. It won't tell you the context. Our photos showed an expanse of sand, a few damp depressions, and a thin line where the tide would have come. We walked the path the footprints had taken. The reeds shushed as the GPS chirped, and our shoes made the same small noises people make when they are aware of being watched by memory, rather than by a person. Halfway up the small dune, the prints petered out again, lost under a mat of dried grass. There was no house to check, no porch light to explain the presence. The place felt like it had been scrubbed clean in the polite way that only tide and time can accomplish. That afternoon, back at my car, I tried to keep a rational inventory. There are reasonable narratives. Fishermen come and go. Someone could have rowed in and hauled their boat up between low tides. Boats get moved. People do odd things and don't tell. None of those possibilities was satisfying because they felt like workarounds, duct tape answers. They didn't account for the timing from the morning we'd been there in the fog to the scene we found. It's entirely possible, sure. But there's a different kind of tension when you know you were not alone in seeing something and the world returns a blank when you look again. It amplifies the dissonance between perception and environment. We did one other thing that day. We stood at the edge of the water and listened, not for oars, not for anything specific. We just stood and let the place make the noises it wanted. The bay made the small, honest sounds of a place that doesn't owe you anything. Waves, a gull here and there, the distant thunk of a piling. But under those sounds, when I cupped an ear, there was a faint, regular rhythm that could have been tide or could have been memory. Edwin shrugged. We got in the car and drove away with questions that didn't have addresses. At some point after that, I started noticing smaller patterns in myself. Fog warnings on the weather app stopped being incidental. They became triggers. I found myself checking for dents under parking lot lights, running a hand along the bumper of my car like one does with old scars. If I was alone at night and a muffled sound ran along the edge of my hearing, a garbage truck slumping or a neighbor mowing, I braced with the same small animal readiness I had become used to. I would look for a minute and then, like someone habitually taking the stairs 2 at a time, I would force myself to do something ordinary. Wash dishes, rehearse a song lyric, make coffee precisely how I always did it. Rituals steady you. They were my repair kit. I should be honest, there were nights when I lay awake thinking about causality and the limits of reason, and in those nights my mind offered outlandish possibilities that I knew were ridiculous, even as they felt true in the moment. People make mistakes in the dark. Our senses conspire. The human brain loves a narrative. Those are correct and important things to remember. But the other truth is also true. There was physical stuff left in these places, and things that hummed in ways that matched the timing of my life. You hold both truths at once, or you lose track of which things you are even trying to explain. I tried to translate that tension into a practice that felt halfway between scientific and superstitious, documenting without claiming. My recorder files grew. I kept a small notebook with the date, a simple line about conditions. Light fog, 6:15 a.m., little wind, and an inventory of anything odd. Dent, drone, footprints. I stopped telling the stories as if I was pistol-whipping listeners into belief. Instead, I learned to tell the small details and let them be what they are, raw, unadorned, and sometimes inexplicable. There was one night where the fog did something I can't explain and maybe never will. I was driving a back way that avoids the highway's sweep, because lately those roads felt like safer territory, predictable corners, houses where porch lights blink on at regular intervals. It was late, almost to the hour where only taxi drivers and insomniacs were out. Fog rolled across the asphalt like a low curtain, and I slowed to a pace that made the trip longer than necessary. My radio was off. The world in the car had the concentrated smallness of breath. Ahead, between the white, I thought I saw motion on the shoulder. At first it was a darker kind of fog, like a fold in fabric. Then, as I approached, it resolved into something vertical and slow. I braked out of habit and watched. The thing, if it was a thing, led the fog like a pole leading a ribbon. It moved so slowly it might as well have been the fog itself deciding to wear a shape for a moment. I tried to tell myself it was a stanchion, a mailbox, a leaning tree. None of those explanations fit the way the shape seemed to pause, as if considering me. I felt the old muscle memory of that Highway 101 night tighten across my ribs. I didn't stop. I didn't get out. I didn't do any of the heroics you see in movies where someone rushes toward mystery for the sake of a cathartic reveal. Instead, I kept driving, my hands tight, my breath a shallow count. When I passed the place where the shape had been, the fog had smoothed back into an even white, and there was nothing left to show. A week later, I would tell myself I had been tired, that headlights throw illusions, that the mind in low visibility supplies more than the world has to give. What really stayed with me, and what still does, wasn't any single sighting. It was the way each occasion rearranged my sense of ordinary metrics. Distance stopped meaning what it used to mean. Sound stopped being a reliable child of cause. A footprint could be both proof and a tease. The stories clustered into a kind of pattern that had a grammar. Fog reduces certainty. Something appears or matches you in movement or sound, and a piece of physical reality remains that refuses to be pinned to a coherent narrative. I didn't stop living. I drove, I ran, I kayaked. But I started carrying a little emergency kit in the trunk of my car with a flashlight, a thermal blanket, and a cheap pry bar, because worrying doesn't pay, preparation does. I also, in a private way, began reading about environmental acoustics and infrasound, because I like to triangulate possibility. Some of what I read was useful, some of it didn't fit my experiences at all. Infrasound can make people nauseous and anxious. It can also make a room feel heavy. Local machinery can throw notes in odd ways, and yet those explanations did not account for the pattern of timing I observed. Notes that seemed to shadow a pace I set, or a person who stood and watched without moving, as if holding still were a choice. I realize now that part of the reason these stories stick with people is that they reflect a basic human fragility. We are built to believe that our environments have rules, and when those rules change without comment, we notice it like a jolt. A dent in a bumper is a rule change. A sudden set of footprints is a rule change. A sound that matches the cadence of your breath is a radical editing of how the world normally corresponds to cause. We all carry small belief structures about how the world behaves, and fog, by its nature, erases the signposts we rely on. I don't want this to come off as a plea for supernatural answers. I'm not offering an occult explanation or a curtain to be yanked back. I'm offering what happened to me and asking you to consider how little you need to have your certainty rearranged. That's why I open by saying 3 terrifying true fog horror stories you can't ignore. They're terrifying because they make you reassess what you know about the world and about your own senses. You don't have to accept a ghost or a devil. You don't have to accept any metaphysical thing at all. You simply have to reconcile that the world can hand you physical data that resists tidy causation. If you've followed this far, you've probably already decided whether you're the sort of person who asks, what physical explanation could there be? Or the sort of person who lets the hair on their arms stand up and keeps a light on that wouldn't have been necessary last year. Both reactions are reasonable, both are part of how humans process uncertainty. I promised at the start that I would leave you with an image that lingers. There is one I keep. On the highway night, after the dent, and after the way the hooded figure's stillness hung like an accusation, I sat in a driveway and watched the fog roll down the shoulder like a slow tide. It filled the dips in the land and spilled into the trees, and for a moment it looked not like weather, but like a screen being lowered over the world. The dent in the bumper reflected a garden lamp, like a bruise. The fog did not hide things so much as it rearranged how things related to one another. Where edges had been clear, they softened. Where sequence had been obvious, it blurred. That fog didn't just hide things. It rearranged the rules. If any of this resonated, if you've ever seen something in fog or been followed by a sound that matched your step, tell me in the comments. Share one short line about your experience. I read them. I want to know if I'm alone in noticing these small, irritating misalignments, or if there are others cataloguing the same oddities and making the same quiet trade-offs between explanation and unease. One last thing. If you ever find yourself in thickness like that, fog so close it makes noise out of silence, do what I learned the hard way. Stay visible, stay in well-lit areas when possible, and above all, don't put yourself in harm's way looking for answers. Some things are better left documented than chased. If you're curious, report what you saw to someone who will listen and record the details. Keep your safety first. If you liked these stories and want more real encounters like this, strange, unresolved and grounded, please subscribe and share this with someone who might have their own fog story. Leave that one-line comment below. I read everyone. And if you decide to go out into the mist, take a friend, a light, and a recorder. Not because I believe the recorder will save you, but because we've learned that sometimes the world insists on leaving traces, and it's good to have something that remembers for you.